There was no single moment when reality broke, no audible crack, no visible fracture line running across the sky. Instead, it softened. It lost its edges. What once behaved with stubborn predictability began to drift, as if the rules themselves had grown tired of being enforced. At first, the change was subtle, easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize. But subtlety, as history reminds us, is how the deepest transformations enter the world. For centuries, we lived inside an assumption so deeply embedded, we forgot it was an assumption at all, that reality, while complex, ultimately made sense, that causes produced effects, that expertise accumulated toward clarity, that if we observed carefully enough, measured precisely enough, and modeled rigorously enough, the world would yield its reasons. Reality was treated like a well-behaved machine. Complicated, yes, but lawful, legible, and obedient to analysis. Then it stopped cooperating. Predictions failed in ways that felt qualitatively different from ordinary error. Models did not merely miss the mark, they contradicted one another while using the same data. Experts spoke with increasing confidence and decreasing accuracy. Events unfolded that were not just unexpected, but unexplainable within the frameworks designed to anticipate them. We did not simply lack information, we lacked orientation. In earlier eras, uncertainty was a temporary condition. It signaled that more data was needed, better instruments required, or improved theories were on the horizon. Now uncertainty has become ambient, permanent. It lingers even after the data is collected, the models refined, the experts consulted. The discomfort does not resolve, it accumulates. This is the first sign that reality has stopped behaving like reality as we were taught to understand it. The second sign is emotional. Confusion no longer feels like ignorance. It feels like betrayal. People sense, often without articulating it, that the old promises have been broken. Not the promises of governments or institutions, but the deeper promise of intelligibility itself, that the world is, at bottom, coherent. That if something happens, there is a reason that can be found and trusted. Instead, explanations multiply while conviction evaporates. We are told stories, then counter-stories, then meta-stories explaining why no story can be trusted. Every event spawns 1,000 interpretations, none able to establish dominance. Information increases, meaning collapses. We drown in data while starving for understanding. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a mismatch between the structure of reality and the tools we are using to interpret it. The modern mind was trained in an environment where linear causality dominated. Push here. Something moves there. Change a variable. Observe a result. But the systems we now inhabit, social, economic, technological, psychological, are no longer linear. They are recursive, reflexive, and self-altering. The act of observing them changes their behavior. The act of predicting them alters their outcome. Feedback loops multiply faster than comprehension can track. Reality, in this sense, has become reactive. Consider how narratives now behave. A prediction is made, not to forecast the future, but to influence it. A model is released, not to describe reality, but to shape behavior. Information is no longer a mirror, it is a lever. The map does not represent the territory, it interferes with it. In such an environment, accuracy becomes less important than impact. Truth competes with virality, coherence competes with speed. And under these conditions, reality begins to feel unstable, not because it has lost all structure, but because its structure no longer aligns with our expectations. We keep asking, why did this happen? As if the answer must exist in a single, traceable cause. But many modern events are the product of countless micro-decisions interacting non-linearly across time and scale. No individual choice explains them. No single model captures them. They are emergent, real, undeniable, and yet resistant to reduction. This is deeply unsettling because it undermines a psychological contract we didn't know we had signed, that the world would be understandable enough to navigate confidently. When that contract dissolves, anxiety rushes in to fill the gap. People respond in predictable ways. Some cling harder to simplified explanations, even false ones, because any certainty, is preferable to disorientation. Others retreat into cynicism, concluding that nothing is real, nothing is knowable, and nothing matters. Still others outsource their judgment entirely, hoping someone somewhere still knows what is going on. But beneath these reactions lies a more uncomfortable possibility that reality has not broken at all, that it is behaving exactly as it always has. But our era has stripped away the illusions that once made it feel stable. For most of history, the complexity of the world was hidden by distance, by slowness, by limited visibility. Consequences took years to emerge. Information traveled slowly. Errors could be localized, contained, forgotten. Today, everything is immediate, interconnected, amplified. Small disturbances cascade into global effects. Local misunderstandings scale into systemic failures. What feels like chaos may simply be unfiltered complexity, yet acknowledging this offers little comfort. Complexity without comprehension feels indistinguishable from madness. And so we arrive at a strange inversion. The more sophisticated our tools become, the more primitive our sense of orientation feels. We can simulate worlds we do not understand. We can predict trends we cannot explain. We can generate answers without knowing which questions matter. This is the moment when reality stops feeling real, not because it has vanished, but because our confidence in accessing it has eroded. We still wake up in the same physical world. Gravity holds, time moves forward, but the frameworks that once translated experience into meaning no longer hold steady. The gap between what happens and what we can explain widens, and in that gap, narratives compete, trust dissolves, and certainty becomes a scarce resource. This chapter is not an attempt to resolve that gap. It is an acknowledgement of its existence. Because before we can ask how to rebuild meaning, we must admit that something fundamental has shifted. Not just in institutions or technologies, but in our relationship with reality itself. The world has not become irrational, but it has become less accommodating to the stories we tell about it. And that may be the most disorienting truth of all, that reality does not owe us clarity, coherence, or comfort. It never did. We simply lived for a long time under conditions that allowed us to pretend otherwise. Now the pretense has worn thin. What comes next will depend not on restoring old explanations, but on learning how to think, decide, and stand upright in a world that no longer behaves the way we expected it to. This chapter marks the moment we stop denying that shift and begin facing it directly. There was a time when presence was simple. To be somewhere meant not being elsewhere. Location implied commitment, attention implied focus, and identity implied continuity. The world was arranged so that one thing followed another, one place replaced the last, and contradictions were resolved by choosing a side. This clarity shaped not only how we navigated physical space, but how we understood truth, responsibility, and selfhood. That clarity no longer holds. We now exist in a condition that resembles superposition, not in the technical language of physics, but as a lived experience. We are here and there at once, present and absent, involved and detached, acting and observing simultaneously. The paradox is not metaphorical, it is structural. Modern life demands that we occupy multiple states at the same time without fully resolving into any of them. This is not merely a technological phenomenon, though technology accelerates it. It is a deeper shift in how reality is organized and how consciousness is forced to respond. Consider attention. You are in a room, but part of you is elsewhere, tracking messages, monitoring events, anticipating interruptions. Even in silence, the mind remains distributed. It does not settle. Presence has become porous. The boundary between now and elsewhere has thinned to the point of irrelevance. This is the first layer of superposition, spatial and temporal overlap. We live in multiple contexts at once, each exerting a weak but persistent pull. None dominates long enough to feel solid. The second layer is psychological. We hold beliefs provisionally, ready to abandon them at the first sign of social friction or new information. Conviction has been replaced by optionality. To commit fully is to risk being wrong in public, and public wrongness now carries disproportionate cost. So, we hover. We entertain positions without inhabiting them. We agree without believing. We dissent without acting. This produces a strange, internal tension. The mind evolved to resolve ambiguity through choice. Yet the modern environment rewards hesitation. Indecision is framed as openness. Detachment is framed as sophistication. The result is a population trained to remain in a suspended state, never collapsing into decision, never fully accountable. In physics, superposition collapses upon measurement. In human systems, collapse is delayed indefinitely. This delay is not neutral. It reshapes identity itself. When you are always partially elsewhere, the self becomes fragmented. You are a professional in one context, a persona in another, an observer in a third. None is false, but none is complete. The question, "Who are you?" becomes increasingly difficult to answer without qualifiers. We adapt by becoming modular. We learn to switch masks rapidly, to speak in codes that change with the audience. Flexibility becomes survival, but over time, adaptability begins to erode coherence. Without a stable center, every context feels provisional. Every role feels temporary. This is the hidden cost of superposition, not confusion, but exhaustion. Holding multiple states simultaneously requires constant cognitive energy. The mind must track contradictions without resolving them, maintain readiness without commitment, and process stimuli without closure. The result is a low-grade fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure, because it is not physical. It is ontological. The paradox deepens when we consider knowledge itself. We now know more than ever, yet believe less. Information arrives faster than it can be integrated. Facts are immediately contextualized, challenged, reframed. Certainty collapses before it can stabilize. We are informed but undecided, educated but ungrounded. This creates a peculiar asymmetry. Action requires certainty, but certainty is perpetually postponed. And so systems move forward not because individuals believe in them, but because momentum carries them along. Decisions are made not by conviction, but by inertia. In this way, superposition becomes institutional. Organizations adopt policies while signaling doubt. Leaders speak in absolutes while hedging in private. Commitments are made with built-in escape clauses. Nothing is fully owned. Responsibility disperses across committees, algorithms, and processes. When outcomes fail, blame collapses into ambiguity. No one was fully there when the decision was made. At a cultural level, this manifests as irony. Sincerity is treated with suspicion. Passion is filtered through self-awareness. To care too much is to expose oneself. And so we learn to half care, half commit, half believe. We occupy emotional superposition, protecting ourselves from disappointment by never fully arriving. But irony cannot sustain meaning. It can only delay loss. The deeper problem is not that we are in multiple states, but that we have forgotten how to collapse into one. We have lost the discipline of presence, not the romanticized presence of mindfulness slogans, but the difficult presence of consequence. The willingness to stand somewhere, knowing it excludes other possibilities. Superposition feels safe because it preserves optionality. Yet life does not resolve itself in optional mode. Choices accumulate regardless of our reluctance to choose. Time collapses states whether we consent or not. And when collapse occurs without agency, it feels like fate. This is why so many experience modern life as something that happens to them rather than something they participate in. They are technically involved, constantly responding, yet rarely deciding. They exist in a permanent almost committed, almost informed, almost responsible. The paradox of being here and there is not merely confusing, it is disempowering. To reclaim agency does not require eliminating complexity or retreating from connectivity. It requires recognizing that superposition is a condition, not a destiny. There are moments when collapse is necessary, when one must choose a position, a value, a direction, knowing that alternatives will be forfeited. This is uncomfortable. It reintroduces risk. It invites error, but it also restores coherence. Reality does not demand that we resolve every contradiction. It demands that we inhabit at least one state fully enough to act meaningfully. Without that, we drift, well-informed, hyper-aware, and strangely absent from our own lives. This chapter marks the recognition of that drift. Being here and there may be unavoidable in a complex world, but remaining everywhere is another form of nowhere. And unless we learn how and when to collapse our superpositions, intentionally, deliberately, we will continue to experience reality as thin, unstable, and unreal. Not because reality has dissolved, but because we have stopped fully arriving in it. Distance used to mean something. Space separated causes from effects, intentions from consequences, one life from another. To act here was not to act there. To decide now was not to decide later. The world had buffers, gaps that absorbed shock, delayed reaction, and allowed responsibility to remain local. Those buffers are thinning. We now inhabit a condition best described as entanglement. Actions taken in one place reverberate elsewhere with surprising speed and disproportionate force. Choices made by distant actors shape local realities. Signals travel faster than reflection. Distance, while still physically real, has lost much of its insulating power. This is not merely a matter of connectivity. It is a change in how causality itself is experienced. Entanglement in this sense does not mean that everything is connected in a vague, poetic way. It means that separation no longer guarantees independence. Systems that appear distinct behave as if they are bound together, responding to one another without clear intermediaries. Cause and effect remain, but the pathway between them becomes opaque. The result is a world that feels intimate and alien at the same time. Consider how events now arrive in consciousness. A decision made in a distant boardroom alters livelihoods thousands of miles away. A rumor spreads across continents before verification can begin. A conflict erupts in one region and reshapes political moods in another. These are not new phenomena, but their speed, scale, and unpredictability are. What once unfolded over years now unfolds in hours. What once required proximity now requires only exposure. This compression of distance produces a peculiar psychological effect. We are affected by far more than we can influence. The sphere of concern expands faster than the sphere of control. We witness suffering, injustice, and upheaval in real time, yet remain largely powerless to intervene. This imbalance generates chronic tension, an emotional overload, without an outlet. Entanglement, then, is not only structural, it is existential. We are entangled with systems we did not choose, actors we will never meet, and consequences we cannot fully trace. Responsibility diffuses, agency blurs. The question, who caused this, becomes difficult to answer, not because no one acted, but because too many did, each contributing a fraction too small to isolate. This diffusion creates moral confusion. Traditional ethics assume a clear line between actor and outcome, but in an entangled world, outcomes are collective, emergent, and distributed. Harm occurs without malicious intent. Damage accumulates without a single decision point. Guilt has no obvious home. As a result, accountability weakens, not through denial, but through complexity. Institutions struggle under this weight. Policies are crafted to address local problems only to trigger distant consequences. Interventions solve one issue while exacerbating another. Feedback arrives too, late or in distorted form. Decision-makers operate with partial visibility, reacting to echoes rather than causes. From the inside, this feels like governance by guesswork. From the outside, it feels like chaos. Yet entanglement does not imply randomness. It implies sensitivity. Small inputs can generate large effects when systems are tightly coupled. Minor disturbances propagate rapidly, amplified by networks that were designed for efficiency rather than resilience. Stability becomes fragile, not because nothing holds it together, but because everything does. This fragility extends to identity. When distance stops mattering, comparison becomes unavoidable. Lives are measured against distant standards. Local norms erode under global exposure. Success, failure, and meaning are no longer defined within a shared context, but against a shifting global reference frame. The self becomes entangled with narratives beyond its reach. This produces a constant sense of insufficiency. No matter where one stands, there is always a distant example doing better, suffering more, or living differently. The result is a perpetual recalibration of self-worth, driven not by lived reality, but by mediated proximity. We feel close to what we cannot touch and detached from what we inhabit. Entanglement also alters how truth functions. When information travels instantly, correction lags behind impact. First impressions harden into belief before verification can intervene. Falsehoods entangle with facts, forming hybrids that resist separation. By the time clarity arrives, attention has moved on. Truth becomes temporal rather than absolute, defined by timing, not accuracy. This undermines trust, not only in institutions or media, but in perception itself. If what appears true now may be false later, and if later rarely undoes earlier impact, then belief becomes provisional. Skepticism becomes reflexive. Commitment feels risky, and yet withdrawal is not an option. Entanglement is not something we can opt out of. Even isolation is a response to distant forces. Even silence reverberates. The temptation then is to seek simplicity, to retreat into localism, tribalism, or rigid ideology. These offer the comfort of boundaries in a world that has dissolved them. They promise clarity by narrowing the field of concern, but they do so at a cost: blindness to interconnected consequences. In an entangled system, denial does not restore independence. It merely shifts the burden elsewhere. The deeper challenge is learning how to act responsibly without full visibility, how to make decisions knowing they will interact with countless unseen variables, how to hold values steady when outcomes cannot be fully predicted. This requires a new kind of humility, not the humility of ignorance, but the humility of partial agency. We must accept that we are neither isolated actors nor omnipotent ones. Our choices matter, but not in linear or controllable ways. Responsibility becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about orienting intentions, adjusting when feedback arrives, and acknowledging participation even when authorship is unclear. Entanglement forces a redefinition of maturity. To be mature in such a world is not to demand certainty or perfect foresight, but to remain engaged despite ambiguity, to act locally with awareness of global reverberations, to resist the fantasy of clean causality, and instead cultivate resilience, adaptability, and ethical steadiness. This chapter marks the point where distance can no longer be used as an excuse, not because we are responsible for everything, but because we are implicated in more than we can easily comprehend. Reality has not collapsed space. It has exposed the threads that always bound it together. What has changed is our awareness of those threads and the speed at which they transmit consequence. When distance stops mattering, indifference becomes impossible. The only question that remains is whether we respond with panic, denial, or a deeper form of responsibility, one capable of operating inside entanglement rather than pretending it does not exist. The chapters that follow will not offer escape from this condition. They will ask what kind of thinking, character, and discipline are required to live within it, without surrendering agency, coherence, or meaning. For a long time, we believed that observation was passive, that to look was merely to register what already existed. The world we assumed unfolded independently of our attention, indifferent to our gaze. Measurement, in this view, was a neutral act, an act of discovery, not interference. We could stand outside reality, examine it carefully, and report what we found. That assumption no longer holds. We now live inside the measurement problem, not as a technical puzzle of physics, but as a lived condition. Observation no longer reveals reality. It alters it. To watch is to participate. To measure is to influence. And the more precise the measurement, the more profound the disturbance. This is not a metaphor stretched too far. It is the defining feature of modern systems. Consider how visibility functions today. The moment something is measured, tracked, ranked, analyzed, it changes behavior. Metrics reshape priorities. Surveillance alters conduct. Attention warps incentives. What gets counted begins to matter more than what counts. This is the first consequence of the measurement problem. Reality adapts to observation. Organizations optimize for indicators rather than outcomes. Individuals curate themselves for visibility rather than integrity. Systems learn to game the measurements imposed upon them. The act of evaluation becomes an intervention, steering behavior in directions never intended by those doing the measuring. The map does not merely misrepresent the territory, it restructures it. This creates a paradox. The more we attempt to control reality through measurement, the less accurately those measurements reflect underlying truth. Indicators become performative. Numbers become signals to be managed rather than facts to be understood. Measurement drifts from description to prescription. At that point, data stops informing decisions and starts distorting them. The problem intensifies when measurement is continuous. Real-time analytics, constant feedback, perpetual monitoring. These promise transparency and control. In practice, they produce reactivity. Systems stop stabilizing. Individuals stop experimenting. Everything moves toward what is immediately legible. Long-term value erodes under short-term visibility. This dynamic reshapes not only institutions, but inner life. Self-observation intensifies. People track productivity, mood, performance, engagement. Reflection becomes quantification. Experience is filtered through metrics before it is fully lived. The self becomes a dataset. At first, this feels empowering. Measurement offers the illusion of mastery. If it can be tracked, it can be improved. If it can be optimized, it can be controlled. But over time, a subtle inversion occurs. Life begins to orient itself around what can be measured, not what is meaningful. Unmeasurable qualities, wisdom, character, depth, fade from attention. They resist quantification and therefore struggle to compete. What remains are proxies, engagement instead of understanding, output instead of purpose, visibility instead of impact. Observation narrows reality. The deeper issue is that observation is never neutral. It carries assumptions, values, and intentions. What we choose to measure reflects what we believe matters. And once measurement begins, those beliefs become embedded in systems, shaping behavior at scale. This is why measurement problems are ethical problems. When performance metrics determine survival, people adapt, even if adaptation undermines the original goal. When surveillance is normalized, conformity increases. When attention is quantified, expression shifts toward provocation. These outcomes are not failures of individuals, but rational responses to observed incentives. Blame in such systems is misplaced. Yet the most destabilizing effect of observation is epistemic. When we know that observation alters outcomes, certainty dissolves. Are we seeing reality as it is, or as it has been, reshaped by our gaze? Are patterns genuine or artifacts of measurement? Are trends emerging or being induced? The line becomes impossible to draw. This leads to a peculiar form of skepticism, not toward facts, but toward the act of knowing itself. Confidence erodes. Every claim is shadowed by the suspicion that it may be a measurement effect rather than an underlying truth. And so we oscillate between two extremes. Either we place blind faith in metrics, surrendering judgment to dashboards and models, or we reject measurement altogether, retreating into intuition and narrative. Both responses miss the point. The problem is not that measurement exists. It is that we have forgotten its power. To measure is to intervene. To observe is to participate. This demands responsibility. In earlier eras, the effects of observation were limited by scale and speed. Today, they are amplified. A metric deployed globally reshapes behavior globally. A ranking published publicly reorganizes incentives instantly. Measurement now operates as a form of governance, often unacknowledged, rarely accountable. This is governance without deliberation. The solution is not to abandon measurement, but to practice it with restraint and reflexivity. We must ask not only what does this measure, but what will this measurement cause? Not only is it accurate, but what behaviors will it reward, suppress, or distort? These questions are rarely asked because they complicate efficiency, they slow deployment, they introduce uncertainty, but without them, measurement becomes a blunt instrument, precise in appearance, destructive in effect. On a personal level, the same discipline applies. Self-observation can clarify or constrict. Reflection can deepen or paralyze. The difference lies in whether observation serves growth or replaces it. When attention becomes surveillance, the self stiffens. When evaluation becomes constant, experimentation dies. Growth requires privacy. This is a difficult truth in an age obsessed with transparency. Not everything improves when exposed. Some processes require darkness, delay, and ambiguity. Some forms of becoming cannot survive continuous observation. The measurement problem, then, is not a technical flaw to be solved. It is a condition to be managed. A reminder that knowledge is not free, that insight has side effects, and that clarity comes with cost. Reality does not reveal itself without being changed by the act of looking. And in a world where observation is continuous, automated, and scaled, the consequences of that change accumulate faster than our ability to reflect on them. This chapter marks the recognition that we are no longer outside the systems we measure. We are inside them, shaping and being shaped in return. The question is no longer whether observation changes everything. It is whether we are willing to take responsibility for what our ways of seeing bring into being. We were taught to imagine time as an arrow. The past lay fixed behind us, the future stretched uncertainly ahead, and the present was the thin blade where choice occurred. Causes lived in the past, effects unfolded in the future. Memory looked backward, intention looked forward, and the two never crossed. This image was so intuitive that we mistook it for necessity. That image is breaking down, not because time has reversed, but because our relationship to it has changed. Increasingly, the future reaches backward, shaping how the past is interpreted, remembered, and even acted upon. Meaning flows in reverse. Anticipation rewrites memory. Outcomes determine explanations. This is the lived experience of retrocausality. At first glance, this sounds like a philosophical trick, an abuse of language. The past, after all, has already happened. But while events cannot be altered, their significance is not fixed. The stories we tell about what happened are constantly revised in light of what comes later. And in complex systems, those revisions do more than change narratives. They alter decisions in the present, which in turn reshape what the past effectively becomes. Consider how intention works. We do not act solely based on what has already occurred. We act based on what we expect will occur. Futures imagined exert pressure on the present. Goals, fears, forecasts, and projections reach backward, pulling behavior into alignment with what has not yet happened. In this sense, causality already runs both ways. What is new is the scale and formalization of this process. Predictions are no longer private guesses. They are public artifacts. Forecasts shape markets. Models influence policy. Expectations reorganize behavior before events unfold. The future is no longer merely awaited. It is actively installed. Once a predicted future becomes influential, it begins to shape the conditions that produce it. This creates a loop. A model predicts an outcome. Actors respond to the prediction. Their responses change the environment. The outcome occurs not because the prediction was true, but because it was believed. Or it fails, because belief altered behavior in the opposite direction. In both cases, the future has acted upon the present, which then redefines the past narrative. Afterward, we say, it was inevitable, or the warning signs were obvious, or no one could have known. These statements project backward a coherence that did not exist at the time. Memory becomes retrospective certainty. This retroactive clarity is comforting. It restores the illusion that the world makes sense after the fact. But it is also misleading. It hides the contingency of events, the fragility of decisions, and the influence of imagined futures on actual outcomes. The danger is not that we reinterpret the past. That is unavoidable. The danger is that we forget we are doing it. When the future shapes the past unconsciously, responsibility erodes. Failures are reframed as unavoidable. Successes are treated as proof of foresight rather than fortune. We construct narratives that absolve or glorify without accurately reflecting the uncertainty that existed when choices were made. This distorts learning. True learning requires acknowledging how little was known at the time. Retrocausal narratives replace that humility with hindsight. They teach the wrong lessons, encouraging overconfidence in prediction and underestimation of chance. At a personal level, retrocausality reshapes identity. We reinterpret earlier versions of ourselves through the lens of who we became. Past struggles are reframed as necessary. Past doubts are dismissed as immaturity. The present self edits the past self to appear more coherent than it was. This can be healing, or it can be violent. When retroactive meaning is imposed too rigidly, it erases genuine uncertainty, pain, and ambiguity. It denies the reality of confusion that once existed. In doing so, it pressures the present self to live up to a falsely coherent story, leaving little room for deviation. We become trapped by our own narrative revisions. Social systems amplify this effect. History is rewritten continuously, not always by altering facts, but by shifting emphasis. Events once marginal become central. Figures once praised become condemned. These revisions are often driven not by new evidence, but by new futures, new values, new anxieties, new goals. The past is reorganized to legitimize the present. This is not inherently deceptive. It is how cultures maintain continuity. But when the process accelerates, when revision becomes constant, history loses its stabilizing function. It becomes a resource to be mined rather than a record to be consulted. Under these conditions, orientation in time becomes difficult. If the past is endlessly malleable and the future perpetually projected backward, the present feels untethered. Action loses grounding. Decisions are made in anticipation of narratives yet to be written. We begin to act for the story that will be told later, not for the reality unfolding now. This is retrocausality at its most corrosive. The imagined judgment of the future becomes a governing force. Fear of how actions will be interpreted later constrains choice in the present. Authenticity gives way to preemptive justification. The self splits, one part acting, the other already narrating. And yet, retrocausality cannot be eliminated. To plan is to let the future influence the present. To hope is to allow what does not yet exist to shape behavior. The question is not whether the future reaches backward, but how consciously we engage with that reach. There is a difference between being guided by possibility and being governed by projection. When futures are treated as provisional, they orient without dominating. When they are treated as inevitable, they colonize the present. The discipline lies in holding imagined futures lightly, using them as tools rather than truths. This requires resisting the temptation to rewrite the past too neatly, to leave room for ambiguity, to remember that decisions were made under uncertainty, that outcomes were not guaranteed, and that coherence is often an illusion constructed after the fact. Only then can learning remain honest. This chapter marks the recognition that time is not experienced as a one-way street. Meaning flows backward as well as forward. The stories we tell about what will be shape the stories we tell about what was. If we are not careful, we will live not in the present, but in anticipation of a future narrative that may never arrive, constantly adjusting ourselves to satisfy a hindsight that does not yet exist. To reclaim agency in time, we must learn to let the future inform without dictating, and let the past instruct without imprisoning. Otherwise, we will continue to be shaped by ghosts that have not yet been born. After paradox, there is no return to innocence. Once contradictions are no longer dismissed as errors but accepted as structural features of the world, reality cannot be approached in the same way again. The quantum metaphors explored so far, superposition, entanglement, measurement, retrocausality, do not merely complicate our understanding. They dismantle the expectation that understanding itself will ever be clean, final, or complete. So the question is no longer how do we resolve these paradoxes, it is what kind of reality emerges when we stop trying to resolve them at all. What remains is not chaos, but a different order, one that does not behave according to classical intuitions. Reality after paradox is not broken, it is revealed. The first thing that changes is certainty. In the old framework, certainty was the goal of knowledge. To know something meant to eliminate doubt, narrow possibilities, and stabilize interpretation. In the post-paradox world, certainty becomes a liability. It signals rigidity, overconfidence, and blindness to context. What replaces it is not ignorance, but conditional knowing, understanding that remains responsive to change. Truth becomes situational without becoming arbitrary. This is difficult for the human mind, which evolved to prefer firm ground. But reality does not reward comfort. It rewards adaptability. Systems that survive are not those with the strongest predictions, but those capable of revising themselves without collapse. Knowledge becomes less like a monument and more like a stance, a way of standing that can shift without falling. Reality, in this sense, becomes participatory. We are no longer observers standing outside a finished world. We are embedded agents inside unfolding systems. What we believe affects what we see. What we measure affects what exists. What we anticipate alters what arrives. There is no neutral position from which to judge reality without influencing it. This does not mean everything is subjective. It means objectivity itself must be redefined, not as detachment, but as disciplined engagement. The most reliable perspectives are not those that pretend to be unaffected, but those that account for their own influence. After paradox, humility replaces mastery. The second transformation is in causality. Linear chains give way to networks of influence. Effects no longer point cleanly backward to single causes. Instead, outcomes emerge from interactions, timing, thresholds, and feedback loops. Asking what caused this becomes less useful than asking what conditions made this possible. Responsibility shifts accordingly. Rather than searching for singular blame or credit, responsibility becomes distributed and ongoing. It is no longer about identifying who pulled the trigger, but about recognizing participation in systems that amplify certain outcomes over others. Ethics moves upstream, from reaction to design, from judgment to stewardship. Reality becomes something we help shape, not something we merely respond to. This reshaping extends to identity. The post-paradox self is no longer a fixed essence moving through a stable world. It is a process, adaptive, contextual, and relational. Who you are depends not only on your history, but on the systems you are entangled with and the futures you are oriented toward. This does not dissolve the self. It deepens it. Identity becomes less about consistency and more about coherence, less about maintaining a single narrative and more about holding tension without fragmentation. Strength is no longer rigidity. It is integration across contradiction. The mature self is not the one who resolves paradox, but the one who can live inside it without denial. Time, too, changes character. After paradox, time is no longer experienced as a simple progression from ignorance to knowledge, from confusion to clarity. Instead, it feels layered. Meaning moves backward and forward. Interpretation evolves. Understanding deepens without ever becoming final. Progress becomes recursive. We revisit old questions with new frameworks. We reinterpret past events through expanded awareness. We anticipate futures without pretending to control them. Time becomes less about destination and more about orientation, how we position ourselves amid uncertainty. Reality after paradox is slower in its judgments, but sharper in its awareness. One of the most unsettling shifts is the loss of final explanations. There is no ultimate theory waiting to unify everything into simplicity. There are only models, useful, provisional, limited. This does not weaken knowledge. It makes it honest. When we stop demanding total coherence, partial coherence becomes powerful. We learn to ask better questions rather than insisting on definitive answers. We become attentive to context, scale, and unintended consequences. Wisdom replaces certainty as the highest cognitive virtue. This has cultural consequences. Societies built on rigid narratives struggle. Institutions designed for linear control fail under nonlinear conditions. Authority based on confidence erodes. What gains legitimacy instead is responsiveness, the ability to revise without collapse, to admit error without disintegration. Trust shifts from those who claim certainty to those who demonstrate learning. Reality after paradox also redefines meaning. Meaning is no longer discovered as a hidden structure embedded in the universe, waiting to be decoded. It is generated through interaction, through values enacted under uncertainty. Meaning arises not from knowing how things are, but from choosing how to respond to how things behave. This restores agency without illusion. We cannot control reality, but we can orient ourselves within it. We cannot eliminate paradox, but we can decide how we live in its presence. Meaning becomes less about explanation and more about commitment, what we choose to stand for when outcomes are uncertain and narratives unstable. In this way, paradox does not lead to nihilism. It leads to responsibility. Reality after quantum paradoxes is not colder or more alien. It is more demanding. It requires attention, humility, and ethical steadiness. It punishes simplistic thinking and rewards depth. It exposes illusions but offers something in return, participation in a world that is alive, responsive, and unfinished. The final illusion to fall is the belief that clarity precedes action. In this new reality, action often comes first. Understanding follows later, shaped by consequence. Waiting for certainty becomes a form of avoidance. To live well after paradox is to act with care, revise with honesty, and remain open without dissolving. Reality does not owe us comfort, closure, or simplicity. What it offers instead is something harder and more valuable. The chance to engage honestly with a world that exceeds our explanations, yet still responds to our choices. This is what reality becomes after paradox. Not something to be solved, but something to be lived with discipline, awareness, and courage.